Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship by Venture for Canada. Venture for Canada is a national charity on a mission to foster the entrepreneurial skills and mindsets of young Canadians. Our vision is a Canada where young people can equitably realize their entrepreneurial potential to help build one of the most prosperous entrepreneurial ecosystems in the world.
I am very excited to have the opportunity to interview Abi Coman-Walker on Venture for Canada's podcast, A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Abi could speak on many different topics, but today we're excited to speak about how to build flexibility in your career as interests change over time. And I think Abi is a phenomenal person to speak on this topic, as she has had a breadth of career experiences, including being an executive at HSBC, a leading international bank, but now the chief operating officer of one of Canada's leading therapeutics companies. And the company played a critical role in the delivery of the COVID-19 vaccines. Abi, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for the invite. Much appreciated.
Thank you. And Abi, to get things kicked off, can you describe at a high level some context on your career journey to date?
Certainly. I mean, I think it's very important to understand that from the very beginning of probably my existence, I've been a bit of a variety junkie. So I've always liked to do different things, be able to have, my fingers in multiple pies, to be able to really challenge myself with a variety of opportunities. And so that has really, frankly, led my career for the last 20-ish years. Um, so, at a high level, I actually started my career post university. I got a degree in politics, philosophy, and economics because I couldn't choose one subject, so I had to do three. And I went on and I joined PricewaterhouseCoopers in their consulting practice. I was in the UK at the time, and in the UK, it's very common to go into what are called graduate jobs. So these are graduate programs. You join out of university, and you spend the next 2 or 3 years basically being trained. And I went to PricewaterhouseCoopers. I was in their consulting practice, which meant that I also did my management accounting qualification with them. But after about 2, 3 years, at this point in time, there was the whole Arthur Anderson Enron debacle, and all of the big accountancy firms were encouraged, shall we say, to sell off or get rid of their consulting practices. And so I ended up at IBM, which was a bit of a shock to the system, to be honest. I hadn't really planned on ever working for a large tech provider. I'm the kind of person that goes for the try turning it off approach on technology. And so when people knew I worked at IBM, they kept asking me questions that I couldn't answer. Like, why does it do this? And I was like, I don't know. But if you'd like to know about financial accounting, I can totally help you with that. So I decided that wasn't really for me anymore, and I was looking for opportunity to go overseas. My background is that my mother was a diplomat. I lived all over the world as a child, and I'd been in the UK for a while and was getting a little bit of an itchy feet problem. At which point I came across this program that is run by HSBC globally. It's called the International Manager Program. And essentially, what you do is you become a globally mobile resource for HSBC, and they send you off and to do whatever they feel like is a value-adding thing for you to do in wherever they feel like it's a value-adding place for you to be. It's a really exciting. It's kind of like being in the foreign service, but within a corporate environment. In fact, at one point, these people were called international officers, but that's when they didn't let girls in, and the world was a different place. And so I was with the HSBC doing that for just about 17 years, which was an enormously exciting time. I did all sorts of things. I've got all sorts of great stories. But I ended my career with them in 2021 here in Canada. I was here. My last posting with HSBC was here in Vancouver. And I think, like many people, I used COVID as an opportunity to reevaluate. I'd had this amazing career, but my personal circumstances had changed. I had children now. My flexibility was less. And I'd sort of spent almost 20 years in one organization. I was like, you know what? It might be time to try something different. And so I looked around Vancouver and I was like, well, what does Vancouver do well? And the answer to me was around small, medium-sized, entrepreneurial innovation, and they do it across lots of different industries. There's all sorts of companies here that the world has not necessarily ever heard of, but are actually really cool and doing some really, really funky stuff. And I was like, oh, I could totally do that. And then through some furious networking and an awful lot of meeting the right people, I was very fortunate to be offered the role as Chief Operating Officer for Acuitas Therapeutics, which is the biotechnology I currently work for.
Such a fascinating career and life story. One thing to zoom in on a little bit is your childhood, and I think it's so interesting that you said your mother was a diplomat. You lived all over the world. How do you think that that upbringing influenced the way that you see the world?
Oh, I mean, it's absolutely influenced the way I see our world. I mean, it's kind of interesting. I mean, my father died when I was very young, and so my mom was a single parent. And typically I think single parents get a very hard rap. There's the cards are very much stacked against them. But my mom was able to do amazing things, including build this amazing career within the international aid program in the UK. And with that, we were able to move and live overseas. So by the time I graduated high school, I'd lived in Africa, India, and Thailand. And actually, I graduated high school in India. And frankly, that opportunity to be part of different cultures, to move a lot, to learn how to be extremely resilient and flexible in life has been completely foundational for me as I've then become an adult. And the variety junkie thing. I mean, that's absolutely the product of that lifestyle. I mean, if you never live anywhere more than 2, 3 years, you do tend to get a little bit of itchy feet occasionally and need something new and shiny to have a go at. And it also translates into how I operate as a leader. And I think if you spoke to my team, they would absolutely tell you that I get a lot of great ideas. I'm not brilliant at the follow through, but I'm absolutely the ideas person, and that's why my team are wonderful at actually executing and getting this stuff done, and making sure that those dreams and thoughts become a reality. Because that's very much a reflection of kind of how I operate as a person.
I love that, and yeah, it would be such a unique upbringing. I grew up in Nova Scotia pretty much my whole like childhood, but I did change schools, like, and they were like 40 minutes away. And I remember starting grade 7, and just like the fear I had of going to a school where I like knew no one. And sometimes I think of different kids who they do that like 10 times. There are a lot of people I went to school with whose parents work for ExxonMobil,
Right.
and they similarly had,
Yeah.
like you, like very similar story in terms, except different type of business or
Mhm.
organization. Um, so, what was it like as a kid to kind of always have to make new friends? Like in essence, you have friends for 2 years, you move on, you kind of do. And and how do you think that that kind of influences you today, or and the way you operate?
Yeah, no, I mean, so I went to 13 different schools between kindergarten and graduating high school. Um, and I think that, I mean, to a certain degree, that was normal life for me. So it's difficult to, I have no idea what it would have been like to grow up in Nova Scotia for my whole life. Like, I can't, I, don't- I mean, I can't understand what that would be like, just like it's very difficult. So for me, it was just lived experience.
Yeah.
Um, so I think what I got, and I'm an only child as well, so I think that's important context. So, making friends was always going to be necessary if I wanted to talk to other people. And so I did get very good at it. I think what I would observe is that it is very challenging to move schools frequently. It is very challenging to leave your friends behind and start again. Um, and I think that kids that if I looked around my peer group who did that, and I'm very fortunate to still be friends with many of them, but those are the resilient ones. Those are the ones that manage to do it. Those are the ones who have come out the other side. There are people that it is too challenging for. And so it is very tough. And I think it creates, it makes you quite tough. You have to be resilient. You have to be prepared to be rejected because not everybody is going to be your friend. And you have to be prepared to make the effort. My mom gave me some great advice, and actually, particularly when I went to university, which is, when you first get to a place, you have to say yes to everything, even the stuff you don't want to do, because invites don't necessarily come twice. So if you want to start off on a great footing, you just have to say yes. You have to keep going, keep doing it all, go to all the parties, go to all the invites, and make sure that you're there and present, because then you will get a second invite.
Yeah.
And so I think that is definitely something that I have carried through into my adult years. I mean, I tend to, I mean, maybe it's FOMO at this point. We've got a nice new word for it now. But I think grasping that new adventure, being curious about people. I am massively curious about people. I think that, meeting new people is an opportunity to learn something every time you do it, because people's lived experiences are so different. And I think that's, that curiosity has set me well as a child, because it meant that I was like, hey, who are you? And I was, and I'm confident enough that I could do that. Like I can walk into people's conversations and just be like, hi, I love your shoes. Um, and that's also set me up well, I think, into adulthood as well.
It's so fascinating. One thing I'm interested in is it seems like your mother was like a role model or had like a
Oh, yeah.
significant impact on you. What are some of the broader lessons that you learned from your mom?
Oh, my gracious. My mother is an extraordinary woman. She really is. I mean, so again, contextually, my mom didn't go to university until I was 3 years old. And so, she in her must have been what, late 20s, she found herself widowed with a child. My grandparents were not wealthy, and they offered the support that they could, but it wasn't easy. And she managed to not only get through her university degree, though she always tells me that every time the night before she had a big exam, I would get sick every single time. Obviously, her nervousness rubbed off on my immune system, and it all, created chaos. But despite all of that, she was able to get her university degree, get this amazing job, and then build this career within the international aid program in the UK. And I was very fortunate at various points in my life to meet her colleagues, and they talked about my mom being a role model for them, right? I mean, this was in the 1970s, where there were still a lot of barriers for women. It wasn't easy. I don't think it's easy today, but it was even harder then. um, and so I've learned again about not giving up, being resilient, you know knowing my own worth, not listening to the detractors who say that women can't do stuff, and that, you know, we should all be home doing the dishes. She built my feminist inner core in many ways. And but also taught me that kindness has a lot to play into that, and that if you can be kind, you will ultimately always come out on top, because you'll be able to, and not that coming out on top is the point, but as in you'll always come out feeling like you've done the right thing, and feeling like you are able to hold your head up and be proud of what you've achieved, because you haven't stepped on other people to get there. You haven't put other people down in order to assert yourself. And I think that was one of the things that my mom was very clear about. I think the other one, which is one I am very keen to pass on to my own children, of which I now have three, um, is around taking care of things bigger than yourself. So by that I mean, my mum worked in international aid. The international aid program is all about helping developing nations. It's about dealing with poverty and the lack of sanitation in the world, and helping people who have not had the privileges of others to be able to, thrive as well. And, in many ways, she had a life of service as a result of that. And I think for me, then that's really translated into how can I contribute beyond my immediate environment? How can I make a difference, small or big, on the world, so that I leave it a better place than how I found it? That translates to how can I, when I came here to Acuitas, I started the Community Impact Committee. This is about how Acuitas can give back to the world. But also in my own life, and making sure that we're taking care of ourselves, our environment, our community, and that's a very strong value in my life.
Your mom sounds like she was a remarkable, or she is
She
a
is
remarkable
honestly,
person.
she's a remarkable human. She would never actually own that herself, I would say. She's very modest. And it's very interesting, because when we talk sometimes, she feels guilty. And mummy guilt is a very common thing, right? You feel bad that you missed she missed birthdays, she missed, concert recitals or whatever it was. I was an actress in school, so, she missed some of the plays. And when we talk, sometimes she focuses on that and how guilty she felt. And I'm always like, my gracious, mom, you created this extraordinary life for us. And yet she still feels guilty. And so one of the things I rail against is mummy guilt. I'm not a believer in it. I think, we all have to do what we have to do, and everybody comes out the other side if we focus on being authentic and just being kind, frankly.
Absolutely. And no one can do it all.
And no
Uh,
one can do it all.
no. Even though there can be pressure too,
Yeah.
it's an impossible.
And frankly, anybody on TikTok or Insta or whatever who claims it is faking it anyway. So, you know
Yeah.
what? Be yourself and recognize your limitations. I certainly have plenty of them.
It sounds like your mom was also somebody who embraced flexibility in her life or career, like to go to university while having like a young child
Mm.
and be widowed, to then take on a career that requires moving all around the world and living and taking huge risks.
Oh, yeah.
What did you learn from your mom in terms of the importance of flexibility and how to be adaptable?
Do you know what? I think she, in some ways, and she would hate me to use this word, but I think she was a bit of a visionary, because when I started on my career, she was like, "You realize, Abby, that you won't have one career. You'll have multiple. Times have changed, right? People don't stay in one organization and travel linearly anymore." And so she was like, "You need to be thinking about how you're going to structure your life around those careers and what you want each one to be, so that the one you're in feeds into the next one." Um, and I thought that, at the time I was a bit like, what? But actually reflecting upon that, I mean, she's absolutely right. And that is even truer now for today's generations. You have to be able to be flexible. You have to recognize the skills that you bring and how you can use them in other industries, and be able to be flexible to what your career or your environment or whatever it is that you need at the time, so that you are following a path that isn't so set out as it used to be, um, and is much more, I think, curvaceous and meandering than I think careers have traditionally been.
Going forward in time a little bit to your almost 2 decades that you spent at HSBC, what are some of the main learnings that you had from your time at the bank?
Oh, so much. I mean, I essentially grew up. I mean, 20 years in an organization, you've essentially grown up there. I was what, 24ish, maybe slightly younger when I joined. And I, I I learned everything I know today, probably as a result of being at HSBC. I learned to appreciate diversity and inclusion and the importance of really taking advantage of the diversity of perspective around you. I mean, it was fascinating to move to countries where, I understood the infrastructure of the bank. Like, the bank was fairly uniform in terms of how it operated in all of these places. But of course, moving to a different culture, the way people operated was different. There are huge cultural nuances to how you deal with, in somewhere like Taiwan versus how you deal with things in somewhere like Brazil. One of the best examples of this I like to give people is that in Brazil, it is completely normal to kiss your colleagues in the morning. This is completely standard. You know, People come into the office and it's two quick kisses on the cheek and off we go on our day. And I moved from there to Dubai, where men wouldn't shake my hand. Right. I mean, this is just, and you have to be able to navigate both of those environments successfully. And so I think that taught me enormous amounts about being culturally aware, about appreciating the perspective that came from these different cultures and the diversity of opinion it offered, and actually to bring the value out on that, and make sure. And I think the other thing it taught me is the impact of your manager. Frankly, a fantastic manager will change your world for you, right? They'll open up opportunity and possibility and deliver things that you never even knew you needed, but they'll also be really challenging to you, right? They won't let you tell you that you're amazing if you haven't been, right? They'll be kind and they'll tell you what you need to do to get better. A bad manager will either be such a micromanager that you've got no space to operate, or be such an egotist that you're invisible and you're just working in the background, and many other forms. I mean, there are lots of different ways you can be a terrible manager. And frankly, at HSBC, I saw both. And so that really helped me decide what my management style was going to be like and what I wanted to be in terms of contribution to the workplace. So I think that was a huge learning for me. Um, and then I think the other piece that I would say is um, I really learned the craft, my craft. So, in operations, generally speaking, COOs, in my experience, have like one piece of depth and then a lot of breadth. So, you tend to, as a COO, cover a lot of different areas, some of which you will, one or two of which you'll have depth in and you'll understand, and then a lot of which you will not. You won't have the depth. And so you have to learn to lean into other people. You need to learn how to delegate. You need to learn how to trust other people so that they bring their competency to the table in complement to your own. And you need to make the best use of that. You need to learn to listen and be open to the ideas of others and compromise and negotiate because you won't always be right. In fact, quite often you're not the smartest person in the room on every subject. And so being able to lean into the people who are is really important. So I think that has been a massive learning for me. And that's, both through the international travel and the living in 9 countries, but also through just, operating and doing the things that I did while I was there.
Of all your managers during your time at HSBC, who's the manager that you learned the most from and why?
Oh, so his name was Ralph Heydrich, and he was an ex McKinsey's partner who joined HSBC in I don't know, I can't quite remember what his role was when I arrived, but so this was at a time when HSBC was in quite a lot of trouble. They had been fined by the US government for failing to prevent financial crime happening through the organization. And they were told very clearly that they needed to get better and clean up their act. And so it was kind of an all hands on deck, a moment where they had to bring lots of people together to try and improve the processes and the culture to prevent the kind of incidences that HSBC had been facilitating previously. And so Ralph was brought in to lead this project, and he hired me without ever having met me. Again, this was all a bit ahead of its time. It's really common now, but back then, it wasn't that usual to interview people halfway across the world and be like, yeah, sure, come work for me. But he saw something and he brought me into the team. And honestly, he was an extraordinary manager. He was that wonderful balance of supportive. So if I had a problem, I knew without the slightest problem, I could go and talk to him, and he wouldn't think less of me because I couldn't figure it out on my own. But equally, he created an enormous amount of space for me to do my own thing. He was like, here is your sandbox, go play. And um, he was just an extraordinary person. He was an amazing communicator. He was an amazing at creating connection with people. He was entirely authentic. He was German, so he's quite literal, which I really appreciated because I quite like literal people because I'm very bad. I'm not great at like reading between the lines often. I find that quite challenging. So he was very much like, you're doing a great job. I know he meant it. And if he was saying, maybe you could think about improving this, I knew he meant that too. And that was it was a very honest, authentic experience working for him. And I think I grew enormously under his leadership. But he was very much one of those people who kind of again looked at the people around him and thought, how can I get the best out of everybody? How can we collectively achieve this goal, not me individually? And I think that's absolutely brilliant. And I really, yeah, I love working with. And then on top of all of that, so when I went on maternity leave with my second child while I was working for him, and he was great about it, unlike my first experience. And then when I came back, he actually promoted me and gave me the opportunity to lead a new team and do something completely different, and again just demonstrated huge amounts of faith in me. That
Ralph
was great.
sounds like a
Yeah,
great guy.
he was
Hey,
awesome.
by the way, this podcast will be once it goes live, you should send it to your mom and send it to Ralph. It'll be a nice be like, hey, I haven't spoken to you. Yeah, well, obviously you probably imagine you talk to your mom, but
I
if
do.
you haven't talked to him recently, just like send him this.
Yeah,
It
he
sounds like a great guy.
retired. He retired a couple of years ago. I sort of keep track of him through LinkedIn, and I wouldn't have any issue reaching out to him, to be fair. But I think he used to. One of his passions was being a pilot, and so I suspect that him and his wife are off exploring the world now, which I think is just fantastic.
Agreed. And such a fascinating career. I think to have that opportunity to work through so many different countries. I was looking through your LinkedIn earlier, and I'd seen that you had worked in like Taiwan,
Yep.
Hong Kong, Brazil, UAE. Like such an interesting life and the experiences to do that. And I've spent pretty much my entire life in Canada. I did live in the US for 5 years, which is quite similar to Canada, although deceptively different
Mm.
in other ways. Depends on which parts of the US, but lots of differences kind of underneath the surface. And I've traveled a fair amount, and something I sometimes struggle with is that cultural adaptation. I think partly because I've spent so much of my life in Canada that sometimes when I'm in a context where I'm like, what's going on here? This is
Yep.
so different than what I'm used to. Um, can you describe maybe a moment in your life, Abby, maybe in particular during your time at HSBC, where you were in a different cultural context that maybe felt like uncomfortable relative to what you were used to, and then you had to use kind of flexibility or lean into that flexibility muscle to adapt. And so maybe to describe the challenge, but also how did you deal with it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it certainly happened, and it happened a great deal, quite honestly. Um, so it's kind of difficult to come up with one example. I mean, other than the whole Brazilian kissing thing, that took some adaptation, quite honestly. Um, as a woman, you're very much told that you should really not go anywhere near your colleagues. Um, and so that was a little bit of a shock to the system. But actually, you know what? It was meant with absolutely great intent. And like everything else, you kind of get used to something. Um, but that's not a great example. But I mean, Brazil was a really interesting one because, and I am a massive, massive fan of Brazil. I think it's an incredible country. It is truly multicultural in a way that I think other places claim, but isn't actually true. And by that I mean is that everybody at their core is Brazilian, and while there are both hereditary cultural differences that have come from history, and there are also new immigration happening in Brazil. And so but they really are able to kind of bring everyone together in a way that I don't think I've witnessed in other places. But um, that doesn't mean that there aren't cultural differences that are a bit of a shock to the system. And I remember um, uh, in I'm going to use the word Western culture, which I'm not really sure is a great use of the word, but let's just it's certainly in British business culture. Let's put it that way. Um, there's this real kind of drive to efficiency and getting things done and knocking things off your to-do list and all of that kind of thing, which is a completely, in some cases, and everything is not. I'm making huge sweeping generalizations here, but is a bit of an anathema to the way they do things in Brazil. Brazil is much more about relationships, making sure that the people are engaged, making sure that, rather than necessarily outcomes, it's actually about the journey. And so things tend to be, from my perception, much less efficient because they spend a lot of time, like meetings, you spend like the first 10 minutes finding out how everybody's kids are and where's the weather been and how are the holidays, rather than, and then eventually you might get to the topic in hand. But if it starts to be a little like onerous, maybe you move off that for a while and you go off on another tangent. And that was a form of cultural adaptation I needed to learn and get used to, because I was like, when like, are we gonna get to the point, like um but I guess what that taught me was actually about the value of that relationship. And I've had this reminded to me a few times that, at the heart of any business relationship is a personal relationship. If you can't connect with the person personally, and that doesn't mean they become your best friend or anything of that nature, but that you have some sort of framework of personal engagement with someone, that from that will come a more successful business relationship. If you treat people like they are business, it doesn't work well. Nobody likes that. Nobody appreciates it. Nobody enjoys it. And so I think that was a really good learn for me. And so for me, there's kind of a happy middle somewhere in there where you do spend the time to get to know people, but equally you kind of try and get the job done too. Um, so yeah, I think that's probably a good example of just being, initially like, I just don't understand what's going on.
One of the takeaways I have from what you're saying is just the importance that you one can learn a lot from different cultural contexts, and sometimes
Absolutely.
going to a place that is very culturally alien to what you've experienced can be something that you pick up little things. And I certainly that I'm proud of Canada and I love Canada, but there's little things from the US, both good and bad, that
Yeah.
sometimes I reflect on and as I move back to Canada. And by the way, it's funny on the face kissing kind of like in a formal introductory. It's something I've actually experienced for in Canada. In Quebec, it's quite common. I would say
Right.
very common
Okay, that makes
to do
sense.
to do the kissing on the. And I remember I now do a fair amount of work in Quebec, and when you're greeting people, particularly I would say francophone Quebecers. There's not everybody, but it is quite prevalent to do the double kiss. And I
Mhm.
remember, especially more in Anglo Canadian culture, there's kind of the like, okay, is this like is this like a harassment type? But
Correct, like, there's a
it's a
certain paranoia to it in yeah, I agree.
so it's funny just when you were describing because I've related within Canada
Mm.
of just feeling very awkward, but I'm like also I don't want to like offend
Yeah, absolutely, you
the
don't want to
person.
offend, so you're like, "Ooh, okay." And
Yeah,
then you can get it all and then, it's got a million ways it can go wrong where you, like, bash noses and yeah, it's fraught with difficulty.
agreed. So you talked a little bit about what motivated you to make that transition from HSBC to Acutus.
Mhm,
In essence, you were both the bank for around 2 decades and looking to try something new.
mhm.
Can you describe at a high level what does Acutus do?
Sure. So, I mean, in that transition, one of the things that I was very keen on was finding a company's whose purpose was one that sort of aligned to my sense of values. And again, I talked about earlier about trying to have a bigger impact than just sort of within my immediate environment. And so HSBC has many, many fantastic qualities, but at the end of the day, it's a bank and its primary duty is to its shareholders, which as a purpose is not overly fulfilling, if I'm perfectly honest. And so this led to the search for an organization that had sort of a greater sense of purpose. And so Acuitas is its mission is really to improve human health. As a biotechnology company, we have the opportunity to provide, through the use of our technology, um, a range of therapeutics and medicines that can really have a massive impact in saving people's lives, but also in quality of life. And there are, a number of diseases out there today that haven't been cured, of which cancer is an obvious example. My father-in-law um, recently experienced cancer, and the treatment for cancer is horrific, frankly, and necessary, entirely necessary, but absolutely horrific. And so, as a biotech company, we are doing work looking at with through our partners. So the way Acuitas operates is we partner with other biotechs and biopharma companies to support them in the development of drugs and therapeutics that go into commercialization stage. And we do that by the provision of a delivery system that is able to transport nucleic acid therapeutics specifically, so mRNA, siRNA, through the body. And protect them and ensure that they are able to do their job inside the body. And so we are working with partners on things like cancer vaccines and genetic editing for diseases like cystic fibrosis, and diseases that are very challenging like malaria, as well as more efficient flu vaccines and treatments for things like RSV. RSV is one I also have quite a lot of personal experience with. My eldest son, caught RSV when he was 3 months old, and we spent a week in the hospital. It was traumatic, frankly, and there was no there was no treatment. There were no vaccines. There are no treatment. It was oxygen and hoping for the best. Unfortunately, he pulled through and he's fine. But that was a pretty scary experience. And so um, with Acuitas and what we're able to do, there is an opportunity and a possibility that better treatments will become available for some of those diseases.
Thanks so much for sharing. And I think it's very inspiring the work that you folks are doing. I can definitely see the motivation of like wanting to be a part of that, and that are really in the business of saving lives. And sorry to hear about the health challenges with your kid a long time ago, but also your father in law. One thing I'm interested to kind of double click on a little bit is that transition from HSBC to working in Acuitas, especially
Hmm.
with the theme of this episode being flexibility. And I made the transition. I actually worked at a bank for the first year after I graduated, so kind of in a graduate type program. And then I transitioned to doing Venture for Canada. And I found the transition very stark. Banks are very structured, often hierarchical institutions that are very different than startups.
Oh yeah.
So, what was that transition like, and how did you navigate it?
Um, it was absolutely brilliant, but not without its challenges, I think is probably the fair summary. So I often joke that there were actually more people at my leaving Zoom for HSBC than there were in the entirety of Acuitas when I joined. And so to go from an organization where, at the time my team was about 400 people at HSBC, and to go from that, which, as you say, is highly structured, everything is policy driven, there's almost no flexibility, and accountability is very opaque, I would say. Particularly with HSBC, where you have the global head office, you've got country led models, who exactly the decision makers are is can be quite complex. And so moving into an organization like Acuitas, where like there is no question where the buck stops, right? Like if I make the wrong decision, that is 1000% on me. And that's quite scary, truthfully. But actually, if you can work in an organization where people are genuinely supportive and where mistakes are accepted, right, as learning opportunities, which frankly, working with scientists works really well because actually that is the scientific process, is usually getting it wrong until you get it right. So, as a group of people to work with, they are fantastic on that, like that, because they are really open to when I say things like, hey guys, we're going to try it this way, and then you're going to tell me if it's working, and if it's not, we're going to change it. They're really open to that, which is something that you could never do in an organization the size of HSBC. You couldn't really be experimental because if it screws up, there's a lot of blame, there's a lot of consequence, and it's just. And I know HSBC is doing an enormous amount to try and change that. They want to be more into it, they want to be more entrepreneurial, but they're a tanker boat, and it's going to take a long time for them to change. And so coming to an organization like this, where you're like, oh my god, like really this is true accountability. Like we're going to make a decision and then we're going to live with the consequences. And then we're going to make a different decision if it turns out those consequences are not what we intended. Is very, very different. And a little bit like ripping a band-aid off. Like it's quite painful initially, but ultimately, you kind of get over the pain and recognize the value of the band-aid in the first place. Um, so I think that was a big transition. I think um, in a smaller organization, those relationships again become even more prominent. Um, there's only like a very limited number of people to get stuff done, and so working together becomes extremely important. One of the things I love about Acuitas is how collaborative the culture is. I can genuinely reach out to any of my colleagues and be like, hey, can you help me out with this? I've got this challenge, do you have any good ideas? And they will do their utmost to help me out, which I just really appreciate. And I've had the pleasure of, I had a small team when I joined. That team is now substantially bigger, and we as a team are very collaborative. We're very focused on, making this the best possible organization that we can, whether that be through our facilities or through our technology or through the way we deal with people and events and marketing and communications and all the stuff that sits in my world, but it's all really focused on making this the best possible environment and culture for the people here. And I think that strong sense of purpose as a team and an organization that also has a strong sense of purpose for its outcomes really creates a quite unusual and dynamic mix. There isn't the politics that you experience in large organizations. There isn't the differences of understanding of what you're trying to achieve. Communications are far easier. Talking to 80 people is much easier than trying to talk to 800. Um, and I think that you know being able to bring everybody into one room is really special.
If there are listeners who are looking or currently in the midst of doing like a career transition of moving drastically across different sectors, what would be just general high level advice that you would give to them on how to make a transition just in general
Sure.
from working into a field that they potentially have no prior experience with?
Yeah, no, and I wouldn't underestimate that that can be challenging. I mean, it wasn't the smoothest journey for me. It isn't going to be, but I think personal resilience again will pay off a great deal. Openness to and authenticity in what you do and do not know. If you come into an industry that you don't know very well, you've got to be honest about that and look for help in understanding. But you do also have to make the effort to try and understand what's going on. You can't just kind of pocket on the side and be like, "Oh, it's fine." So I think, and that talks to also, I think, go in with curiosity, right? Go in with a willingness to be open and learn. Try and figure out what does make this industry tick. Who are the players? Who are the people that have set standards in this world? What does good look like? Because I think that's the kind of thing that does differ by industry. What does fantastic research organization look like? Because it does look different to a fantastic bank or a fantastic retailer or whatever. And then I think it's also about recognizing that and leaning into your own skills. You are being hired for a reason. You bring value. Don't forget that, right? Like, yes, you are probably from an industry point of view and possibly from a job point of view out of your depth. That's fine. You can learn. But you also have a job to do. You are bringing value. So lean in on that. And there are basics across all industries that are just universally, in my opinion, true. So, great people, make good use of people, make sure that everybody feels valued, make sure that, you know, that experience that you bring as a person and the effect you have on others is a positive one. Doesn't matter what industry you're in, that is important. Now, there are going to be differences in what that actually looks like depending on the organization and the culture you're operating in, but it still remains universally true. So lean in on those skills. Great communication skills will suit you wherever you go. Being able to write a decent email that doesn't meander will suit you, right? Business reporting is different. Lean into that. Make sure that you're really bringing the best of your skills to the table, and recognize that you have to adapt to the organization. It doesn't have to adapt to you. You will bring your own flavor and you'll have your own influence, and it will evolve collectively, but ultimately you're there to work in it, to adapt to it and be the person that organization needs you to be.
What are some of the negative consequences on a person when they think the inverse, when they think that the organization needs to adapt to them?
Oh, well, they're going to end up unhappy. I mean, it's really simple. Like, if you think that, it's like if you start a relationship with someone, you're like, oh, they'll change. You're just going to end up unhappy in the end. Like, it won't happen, and you're going to end up frustrated. You're going to end up unhappy. Um, and it's self-limiting. You will learn from adapting to an organization. You will learn. It's like the same as the cultural conversation we were having. If you can learn to be open to that, to be a part of how that culture exists, you learn and you get something from it. Sticking with what you've always known, you're always going to get what you've always got, frankly.
One thing that seems like it's this consistent theme throughout your life, Abby, is that flexibility. It's one of the reasons why we picked this as the theme of the episode, is that from your childhood where you lived all around the world to the time you spend at HSBC, and you also looked around the world to transition across industries. It seems like you're somebody who is very comfortable with adapting,
Mhm.
and that you've had to adapt since you were like a little kid, constantly, time and time and time again. So, what advice do you have in general for listeners on how can somebody kind of foster that flexibility or adaptability specific to their interests,
Mm.
recognizing that like interests change and are somewhat valuable over time?
Yeah, but I think that's actually fundamental to it, right? Like, you have to recognize that your life is constant change. Like, it may not be big change, you may not be, moving overseas or whatever, but you are constantly changing. You are, you're getting older, your needs are changing, your lifestyle choices are changing, everything is changing. And so that can be slow or fast, but change is constant. And so if you learn to flow with that a little, it's much easier. Fighting change is usually a losing battle, right? It usually is extremely stressful. It's almost certainly unproductive, and you need to find a different way of navigating to increase your flexibility and openness to that change. And you can talk to any number of change management specialists, and they'll essentially, this is what they do for a living. It's help navigate and ease the transition of change. um, and we should all adapt that in our own lives. It's not easy, and we have to recognize that, and we sometimes it's quite painful, and sometimes it can be not for the better, frankly. But if you can learn to navigate that, if you can learn to be flexible, if you can learn to negotiate and come up with an even better outcome because you took somebody else's suggestions and your own, and you come up to something together that is change, but ultimately is change in a different form or change in a different way, then you're going to feel much better. You're going to take ownership of that change. Life will constantly throw curves at you. um, None of us are on a simple trajectory. Life is very complex. And so all of us are able to be flexible. We all have the opportunity to expose ourselves to change and flexibility and learn from it. And so I would encourage anybody who is looking for that to look into their own life and say, actually, I have done this. I have demonstrated this. I have had experiences that have been changes for me that weren't things that I was expecting necessarily, weren't necessarily things that I planned, but I have adapted and I've rolled and things have changed and I've been okay. And so I know I can do it. And that means that I can embrace change going forward. And I don't think there's a person out there that that isn't true for, if they looked inside themselves closely enough.
Humans are incredibly adaptable
We are.
creatures.
I mean, just look at what we're able to do over time. I mean, the exponential growth of technology is, again, a real indicator of that. My grandmother, who is 94, uses an Apple iPad, right? I mean, imagine in her lifetime, when she was born, like the telephone barely existed, right? There certainly weren't any televisions. Like, and to in her lifetime, like, exponential technology change has been extraordinary, and she's managed to adapt. And frankly, if my 94-year-old grandmother can do it, then frankly, so can the rest of us.
Agreed. I love that as a closing message. We all have the capability to be more flexible and to be more adaptable. And I think one of the things I reflect on is another podcast interview we did with a woman named Sukhinder Singh Cassidy, who's a Canadian. She's currently the CEO of Zero, the software accounting firm. And she wrote a book called Choose Possibility. And she talks about, in essence, everyone can like build their risk taking muscle over
Yeah,
time. And it's analogous, but I think likewise, I think you're a great example of it, Abby, is that constant building of your flexibility and your adaptability muscles. And in some ways, it's one of the most important things is to believe in yourself, and then you have the
absolutely.
self-efficacy, the ability to actually go out and be more flexible, to be more kind of adaptable.
Absolutely.
One related question, Abby, that I have is, what do you think are some of the things that hold people back? Why do you think that people can shy away from adaptability or flexibility?
I think because having faith in yourself is a challenging thing to do. It's not something we're taught to do well. Um, People's life experiences don't necessarily draw them to having faith in their own capabilities and abilities. And so I think, and that's a very common experience. I mean, people's childhoods can be very difficult. You know, God, I mean, I can't even imagine being a high schooler anymore. Like, it must be awful. And social media is not helping. And so, it is very difficult if you spent your life feeling like you're struggling to reach inside yourself and have that faith. And so I think that is a major barrier to being flexible and adaptable if you don't really have the confidence in your own capabilities. And I think that we don't do a good job of lifting each other up enough. It is, you know, I have a sort of little bit of a practice that I do every day, which I make sure I lift one person up every day who wasn't expecting it. So it's not like, oh, we're our one-to-one and my member of staff is here and I'm like, oh, you've done a great job. Like, that's completely predictable. I should be saying that. But it's more like, I see a lady on the street and she's wearing a fantastic outfit and I go and make sure she knows that. Right? It's that kind of ability to lift people up because, if we could all lift each other up more, we would all build a little bit more confidence. We would all feel a bit more worthy of ourselves, and that sense of self-worth then drives your ability to deal with a changing world and being more adaptable. And so I would encourage all of your listeners to adopt that practice of lifting someone up every day. Just pick someone. I can't tell you how the impact of that positive reinforcement is on people. It's extraordinary.
And it creates ripple effects. It's
Totally.
like the science of smiling and just being nice, right?
Yeah.
Like niceness is contagious.
I would encourage kindness versus niceness. That's a whole nother different conversation, but yes, the principle is correct.
I agree. Nice can be too
Yeah.
meaningless of a word. Kindness is a much more specific. So
Kindness
I
has an
agree.
edge.
Yeah. Abby, this has been a wonderful conversation. I feel very like zen and like calm at the end of this podcast. And not every episode I do, but I think it's a testament to, I think you have a very like calming presence. And I've really appreciated the things that you've shared. So thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you again so much for having me. And I want to just say as my final thought that I think, what you're trying to do at Venture for Canada is absolutely fantastic. And, this is a country where entrepreneurship and the embracement of innovation is really just so intrinsic to the success of the place. So I think it's wonderful. So thank you very much for all of your efforts. It's brilliant.
Thank you very much, Abby.
Thanks for listening to this episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our socials and through our email list. And be sure to subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss our next episode. Have feedback on today's episode? Let us know directly in the app. Thanks again for listening and for joining the new wave of entrepreneurs. Till next time.